Hi sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy, and this video is another episode of Kidnapped. We're reading chapters 7 and 8 today. So I'll start with chapter 7, I Go to Sea in the Brig Covenant of Dysart. I came to myself in darkness, in great pain, bound hand and foot, and deafened by many unfamiliar noises. There sounded in my ears a roaring of water as of a huge mill dam, the thrashing of heavy sprays, the thundering of the sails, and the shrill cries of seamen. The whole world now heaved giddily up and now rushed giddily downward, and so sick and hurt was I in body, and my mind so much confounded, that it took me a long while, chasing my thoughts up and down, and ever stunned again by a fresh stab of pain, to realize that I must be lying somewhere bound in the belly of that unlucky ship, and that the wind must have strengthened to a gale. With the clear perception of my plight, there fell upon me a blackness of despair, a horror of remorse at my own folly, and a passion of anger at my uncle that once more bereft me of my senses. When I returned again to life, the same uproar, the same confused and violent movements, shook and deafened me, and presently, to my other pains and distresses, there was added the sickness of an unused landsman on the sea. In that time of my adventurous youth, I suffered many hardships, but none that was so crushing to my mind and body, or lit by so few hopes as these first hours aboard the brig. I heard a gunfire, and supposed the storm had proved too strong for us, and we were firing signals of distress. The thought of deliverance, even by death in the deep sea, was welcome to me, yet it was no such matter, but as I was afterwards told, a common habit of the captain's, which I here set down to show that even the worst man may have his kindlier side. We were then passing, it appeared, within some miles of Dysart, where the brig was built, and where old Mrs. Hoseason, the captain's mother, had come some years before to live, and whether outward or inward bound, the Covenant was never suffered to go by that place by day without a gun fired and colors shown. I had no measure of time. Day and night were alike in that ill-smelling cavern of the ship's bowels where I lay, and the misery of my situation drew out the hours to double. How long, therefore, I lay waiting to hear the ship split upon some rock, or to feel her reel head foremost into the depths of the sea, I have not the means of computation. But sleep at length stole me from the consciousness of sorrow. I was awakened by the light of a hand lantern shining in my face. A small man of about 30, with green eyes and a tangle of fair hair, stood looking down at me. "Well," said he, "how goes it?" I answered by a sob, and my visitor then felt my pulse and temples, and set himself to wash and dress the wound upon my scalp. "Aye," said he, "a sore dunt. What, man? Cheer up. The world's no done. You've made a bad start of it, but you'll make a better. Have you had any meat?" I said I could not look at it, and thereupon he gave me some brandy and water in a tin pannikin, and left me once more to myself. The next time he came to see me, I was lying betwixt sleep and waking, my eyes wide open in the darkness, and the sickness quite departed, but succeeded by a horrid giddiness and swimming that was almost worse to bear. I ached, besides, in every limb, and the cords that bound me seemed to be of fire. The smell of the hole in which I lay seemed to have become a part of me, and during the long interval since his last visit I had suffered tortures of fear, now from the scurrying of the ship's rats that sometimes pattered on my very face, and now from the dismal imaginings that haunt the bed of fever. The glimmer of the lantern, as a trap opened, shone in like the heaven's sunlight, and though it only showed me in the strong dark beams of the ship that was my prison, I could have cried aloud for gladness. The man with the green eyes was the first to descend the ladder, and I noticed that he came somewhat unsteadily. He was followed by the captain. Neither said a word, but the first set to and examined me, and dressed my wound as before, while Hoseason looked me in my face with an odd black look. "Now, sir, you see for yourself," said the first. "A high fever, no appetite, no light, no meat. You see for yourself what that means." "I am no conjurer, Mr. Riach," said the captain. "Give me leave, sir," said Riach. "You've a good head upon your shoulders, and a good Scotch tongue to ask with, but I will leave you no manner of excuse. I want that boy taken out of this hole and put in the forecastle." "What you may want, sir, is a matter of concern to nobody but yourself," returned the captain, "but I can tell you that which is to be. Here he is, here he shall bide." "Admitting that you have been paid in a proportion," said the other, "I will crave leave humbly to say that I have not. Paid I am, and none too much, to be the second officer of this old tub, and you can very well if I do my best to earn it. But I was paid for nothing more. If you could hold back your hand from the tin pan, Mr. Riak, I would have no complaint to make of you, returned the skipper, and instead of asking riddles, I make bold to say that you would keep your breath to cool your porridge. Will be required on deck, he added in a sharper note, and set one foot upon the ladder. But Mr. Riak caught him by the sleeve. Admitting that you have been paid to do a murder, he began. Hoseason turned upon him with a flash. What's that? He cried. What kind of talk is that? It seems it is the talk that you can understand, said Mr. Riak, looking him steadily in the face. Mr. Riak, I have sailed with you 3 cruises, replied the captain. In all that time, sir, you should have learned to know me. I'm a stiff man and a dour man, but for what you say the now, fie, fie. It comes from a bad heart and a black conscience. If you say the lad will die. Aye, will he, said Mr. Riak. Well, sir, is not that enough, said Hoseason. Flit him where you please. Thereupon the captain ascended the ladder, and I, who had lain silent throughout this strange conversation, beheld Mr. Riak turn after him and bow as low as to his knees in what was plainly a spirit of derision. Even in my then state of sickness I perceived 2 things. That the mate was touched with liquor, as the captain hinted, and that, drunk or sober, he was like to prove a valuable friend. 5 minutes afterwards my bonds were cut, I was hoisted on a man's back, carried up to the forecastle, and laid in a bunk on some sea blankets, where the first thing that I did was to lose my senses. It was a blessed thing indeed to open my eyes again upon the daylight, and to find myself in the society of men. The forecastle was a roomy place enough, set all about with berths, in which the men of the watch below were seated smoking or lying down asleep. The day being calm and the wind fair, the scuttle was open, and not only the good daylight, but from time to time, as the ship rolled, a dusty beam of sunlight shone in and dazzled and delighted me. I had no sooner moved, moreover, than one of the men brought me a drink of something healing which Mr. Riak had prepared, and bade me lie still, and I should soon be well again. There were no bones broken, he explained. A clour on the head was nothing, man, said he. It was me that gave it you. Here I lay for the space of many days, a close prisoner, and not only got my health again, but came to know my companions. They were a rough lot indeed, as sailors mostly are, being men rooted out of all the kindly parts of life and condemned to toss together on the rough seas with masters no less cruel. There were some among them that had sailed with the pirates and seen things it would be a shame even to speak of. Some were men that had run from the king's ships and went with a halter round their necks, of which they made no secret, and all, as the saying goes, were at a word and a blow with their best friends. Yet I had not been many days shut up with them before I began to be ashamed of my first judgment, when I had drawn away from them at the ferry pier as though they had been unclean beasts. No class of man is altogether bad, but each has its own faults and virtues, and these shipmates of mine were no exception to the rule. Rough they were, sure enough, and bad, I suppose, but they had many virtues. They were kind when it occurred to them, simple even beyond the simplicity of a country lad like me, and had some glimmerings of honesty. There was one man of maybe 40 that would sit on my berthside for hours and tell me of his wife and child. He was a fisher that had lost his boat, and thus been driven to the deep sea voyaging. Well, it is years ago now, but I have never forgotten him. His wife, who was young by him, as he often told me, waited in vain to see her man return. He would never again make the fire for her in the morning, nor yet keep the bairn when she was sick. Indeed, many of these poor fellows, as the event proved, were upon their last cruise. The deep seas and cannibal fish received them, and it is a thankless business to speak ill of the dead. Among other good deeds that they did, they returned my money which had been shared among them, and though it was about a third short, I was very glad to get it, and hoped great good from it in the land I was going to. The ship was bound for the Carolinas, and you must not suppose that I was going to that place merely as an exile. The trade was even then much depressed. Since that, and with the rebellion of the colonies and the formation of the United States, it has, of course, come to an end. But in those days of my youth, white men were still sold into slavery on the plantations, and that was the destiny to which my wicked uncle had condemned me. The cabin boy Ransom, from whom I had first heard of these atrocities, came in at times from the roundhouse, where he berthed and served, now nursing a bruised limb in silent agony, now raving against the cruelty of Mr. Shawn. It made my heart bleed, but the men had a great respect for the chief mate, who was, as they said, the only seaman of the whole jing-bang, and none such a bad man when he was sober. Indeed, I found there was a strange peculiarity about our two mates, that Mr. Riach was sullen, unkind, and harsh when he was sober, and Mr. Shawn would not hurt a fly except when he was drinking. I asked about the captain, but I was told drink made no difference upon that man of iron. I did my best in the small time allowed me to make something like a man, or rather I should say something like a boy, of the poor creature Ransom. But his mind was scarce truly human. He could remember nothing of the time before he came to sea, only that his father had made clocks and had a starling in the parlor which could whistle the north country. All else had been blotted out in these years of hardship and cruelties. He had a strange notion of the dry land, picked up from sailors' stories, that it was a place where lads were put to some kind of slavery called a trade, and where apprentices were continually lashed and clapped into foul prisons. In a town, he thought every second person a decoy, and every third house a place in which seamen would be drugged and murdered. To be sure, I would tell him how kindly I had myself been used upon that dry land he was so much afraid of, and how well fed and carefully taught both by my friends and my parents, and if he had been recently hurt, he would weep bitterly and swear to run away, but if he was in his usual crack-brain humor, or still more, if he had had a glass of spirits in the roundhouse, he would deride the notion. It was Mr. Riach, heaven forgive him, who gave the boy drink, and it was doubtless kindly meant, but besides that it was ruin to his health. It was the pitifullest thing in life to see this unhappy, unfriended creature staggering and dancing and talking he knew not what. Some of the men laughed, but not all. Others would grow as black as thunder, thinking perhaps of their own childhood or their own children, and bid him stop that nonsense and think what he was doing. As for me, I felt ashamed to look at him, and the poor child still comes about me in my dreams. All this time, you should know, the Covenant was meeting continual headwinds and tumbling up and down against head seas, so that the scuttle was almost constantly shut, and the forecastle lighted only by a swinging lantern on a beam. There was constant labor for all hands. The sails had to be made and shortened every hour. The strain told on the men's temper. There was a growl of quarreling all day long from berth to berth, and as I was never allowed to set my foot on deck, you can picture to yourselves how weary of my life I grew to be, and how impatient for a change. And a change I was to get, as you shall hear. But I must first tell of a conversation I had with Mr. Riach, which put a little heart in me to bear my troubles. Getting him in a favorable stage of drink, for indeed he never looked near me when he was sober, I pledged him to secrecy and told him my whole story. He declared it was like a ballad, that he would do his best to help me, that I should have paper, pen, and ink, and write one line to Mr. Campbell and another to Mr. Rankeeler, and that if I had told the truth, 10 to 1 he would be able, with their help, to pull me through and set me in my rights. And in the meantime, says he, keep your heart up. You're not the only one, I'll tell you that. There's many a man hoeing tobacco overseas that should be mounting his horse at his own door at home. Many and many. And life is all about a variorum at the best. Look at me. I'm a laird's son and more than half a doctor, and here I am, man Jack to Hoseason. I thought it would be civil to ask him for his story. He whistled loud. Never had one, said he. I liked fun, that's all. And he skipped out of the forecastle. Chapter 8. The Roundhouse. One night, about 11 o'clock, a man of Mr. Riach's watch, which was on deck, came below for his jacket, and instantly there began to go a whisper about the forecastle that Shawn had done for him at last. There was no need of a name. We all knew who was meant. But we had scarce time to get the idea rightly in our heads, far less to speak of it, when the scuttle was again flung open and Captain Hoseason came down the ladder. He looked sharply round the bunks in the tossing light of the lantern, and then walking straight up to me, he addressed me, to my surprise, in tones of kindness. My man, said he, we want you to serve in the roundhouse. You and Ransom are to change berths. Run away aft with you. Even as he spoke, 2 seamen appeared in the scuttle, carrying Ransom in their arms, and the ship at that moment giving a great sheer into the sea, and the lantern swinging, the light fell direct on the boy's face. It was as white as wax, and had a look upon it like a dreadful smile. The blood in me ran cold, and I drew in my breath as if I had been struck. Run away aft with you, cried Hoseason. And at that I brushed by the sailors and the boy, who neither spoke nor moved, and ran up the ladder on deck. The brig was sheering swiftly and giddily through a long cresting swell. She was on the starboard tack, and on the left hand, under the arched foot of the foresail, I could see the sunset still quite bright. This, at such an hour of the night, surprised me greatly, but I was too ignorant to draw the true conclusion, that we were going north about round Scotland, and were now on the high sea between the Orkney and Shetland Islands, having avoided the dangerous currents of the Pentland Firth. For my part, who had been so long shut in the dark and knew nothing of headwinds, I thought we might be halfway or more across the Atlantic. And indeed, beyond that I wondered a little at the lateness of the sunset light. I gave no heed to it, and pushed on across the decks, running between the seas, catching at ropes, and only saved from going overboard by one of the hands on deck who had always been kind to me. The roundhouse for which I was bound, and where I was now to sleep and serve, stood some 6 feet above the decks, and considering the size of the brig, was of good dimensions. Inside were a fixed table and bench and 2 berths, one for the captain and the other for the 2 mates, turn and turn about. It was all fitted with lockers from top to bottom, so as to stow away the officers' belongings and a part of the ship's stores. There was a second storeroom underneath, which you entered by a hatchway in the middle of the deck. Indeed, all the best of the meat and drink, and the whole of the powder, were collected in this place, and all the firearms, except the 2 pieces of brass ordnance, were set in a rack in the aftermost wall of the roundhouse. The most of the cutlasses were in another place. A small window with a shutter on each side and a skylight in the roof gave it light by day, and after dark there was a lamp always burning. It was burning when I entered, not brightly, but enough to show Mr. Shawn sitting at the table, with the brandy bottle and a tin pannikin in front of him. He was a tall man, strongly made and very black, and he stared before him on the table like one stupid. He took no notice of my coming in, nor did he move when the captain followed and leant on the berth beside me, looking darkly at the mate. I stood in great fear of Hoseason, and had my reasons for it, but something told me I need not be afraid of him just then, and I whispered in his ear, "How is he?" He shook his head like one that does not know and does not wish to think, and his face was very stern. Presently Mr. Riach came in. He gave the captain a glance that meant the boy was dead, as plain as speaking, and took his place like the rest of us, so that we all 3 stood without a word, staring down at Mr. Shawn, and Mr. Shawn, on his side, sat without a word, looking hard upon the table. All of a sudden he put out his hand to take the bottle, and at that Mr. Riach started forward and caught it away from him, rather by surprise than violence, crying out with an oath that there had been too much of this work altogether, and that a judgment would fall upon the ship. And as he spoke, the weather-sliding doors standing open, he tossed the bottle into the sea. Mr. Shawn was on his feet in a trice. He still looked dazed, but he meant murder, aye, and would have done it for the second time that night, had not the captain stepped in between him and his victim. "Sit down," roars the captain. "You sot and swine, do you know what you've done? You've murdered the boy." Mr. Shawn seemed to understand, for he sat down again and put his hand to his brow. "Well," he said, "he brought me a dirty pannikin." At that word, the captain and I and Mr. Riach all looked at each other for a second with a kind of frightened look, and then Hoseason walked up to his chief officer, took him by the shoulder, led him across to his bunk, and bade him lie down and go to sleep, as you might speak to a bad child. The murderer cried a little, but he took off his sea boots and obeyed. "Ah," cried Mr. Riach with a dreadful voice, "you should have interfered long syne. It's too late now." "Mr. Riach," said the captain, "this night's work must never be kent in Dysart. The boy went overboard, sir. That's what the story is, and I would give £5 out of my pocket it was true." He turned to the table. "What made you throw the good bottle away?" he added. "There was no sense in that, sir. Here, David, draw me another. They're in the bottom locker," and he tossed me a key. "You'll need a glass yourself, sir," he added to Riach. Yon was an ugly sight to see. So the pair sat down and hobnobbed, and while they did so, the murderer, who had been lying and whimpering in his berth, raised himself upon his elbow and looked at them and at me. This was the first night of my new duties, and in the course of the next day I had got well into the run of them. I had to serve at the meals, which the captain took at regular hours, sitting down with the officer who was off duty. All the day through I would be running with the dram to one or the other of my 3 masters, and at night I slept on a blanket thrown on the deck boards at the aftermost end of the roundhouse, and right in the draught of the 2 doors. It was a hard and a cold bed, nor was I suffered to sleep without interruption, for someone would be always coming in from deck to get a dram, and when a fresh watch was to be set, two and sometimes all three would sit down and brew a bowl together. How they kept their health I know not, any more than how I kept my own. And yet, in other ways, it was an easy service. There was no cloth to lay, the meals were either of oatmeal porridge or salt junk, except twice a week, when there was duff, and though I was clumsy enough and not being firm on my sea legs, sometimes fell with what I was bringing them, both Mr. Riach and the captain were singularly patient. I could not but fancy they were making up leeway with their consciences, and that they would scarce have been so good with me if they had not been worse with Ransom. As for Mr. Shuan, the drink, or his crime, or the two together, had certainly troubled his mind. I cannot say I ever saw him in his proper wits. He never grew used to my being there, stared at me continually, sometimes I could have thought with terror, and more than once drew back from my hand when I was serving him. I was pretty sure from the first that he had no clear mind of what he had done, and on my second day in the roundhouse I had the proof of it. We were alone, and he had been staring at me a long time, when all at once he got up as pale as death and came close up to me, to my great terror. But I had no cause to be afraid of him. "You were not here before?" he asked. "No, sir," said I. "There was another boy?" he asked again, and when I had answered him, "Ah," says he, "I thought that," and went and sat down without another word except to call for brandy. You may think it strange, but for all the horror I had, I was still sorry for him. He was a married man with a wife in Leith, but whether or no he had a family, I have now forgotten. I hope not. Altogether, it was no very hard life for the time it lasted, which, as you are to hear, was not long. I was as well fed as the best of them. Even their pickles, which were the great dainty, I was allowed my share of, and had I liked, I might have been drunk from morning to night, like Mr. Shuan. I had company, too, and good company of its sort. Mr. Riach, who had been to the college, spoke to me like a friend when he was not sulking, and when he told me many curious things, and some that were informing, and even the captain, though he kept me at the stick's end the most part of the time, would sometimes buckle a bit and tell me of the fine countries he had visited. The shadow of poor Ransom, to be sure, lay on all four of us, and on me and Mr. Shuan in particular most heavily. And then I had another trouble of my own. Here I was doing dirty work for three men that I looked down upon, and one of whom at least should have hung upon a gallows. That was for the present. And as for the future, I could only see myself slaving alongside of Negroes in the tobacco fields. Mr. Riach, perhaps from caution, would never suffer me to say another word about my story. The captain, whom I tried to approach, rebuffed me like a dog and would not hear a word. And as the days came and went, my heart sank lower and lower, till I was even glad of the work which kept me from thinking. Next time we'll start with Chapter 9. Have a great day. Bye-bye.